History is oftentimes unkind to women, a fact that anyone studying the subject can attest to. Despite an awareness of this treatment, though, one can oftentimes find themselves shocked by the injustices done to the women of the past. What makes this subject and the idea of defending wronged women immensely more challenging is the fact that women are human beings. They are flawed, complicated people just as the men of the past are. Investigating whether or not a woman of history is deserving of a full-fledged O.J. Simpson Dream Team-esque defense argument can be a daunting task due to the imperfections of humanity. Alexandra Feodorovna is one of those impenetrable figures whose entire existence can be debated, herself constantly seeming to toe the line between the societal ideas of good and bad. She was the wife of the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, and mother to 5 imperial children, the most infamous of them being Anastasia, whose life was turned into a fictional fairy tale for decades. Alexandra, along with the rest of her family and a number of loyal employees, was murdered during the Bolshevik Revolution in the summer of 1918, which was more than likely the orders of Vladimir Lenin. Russia had been facing a number of social and economic problems, along with a growing dissatisfaction with the Tsar's ability to represent the needs of the people. Their deaths were brutal and tragic when you consider the amount of innocent lives that were living within the doomed familial walls of the Romanov family. What is also profoundly tragic is the life and disposition of the last Tsarina. She was a symbol of dynastic rule that had allowed for the suffering of the masses. That alone allows historians to understand why she was a target for revolutionaries. What is troubling about the situation is the question of why historians and many of her contemporaries, who had dedicated their lives to the study of our past, view this woman with such disdain. How could people who have spent years and years studying both the failures and triumphs of the human race view her with such a lack of sympathy? What is it about Alexandra Feodorovna that solidified her place as a scapegoat for imperial crimes of the past? The answer may appear simple in the broad sense, but beneath the surface are labyrinthine customs perpetuated by a blatant mistrust of women that ran and continues to run rampant. How many of the criticisms placed on Alexandra are viable, and how many are completely unfounded? Does awarding her the moral cushion of sexism forgive her for unforgivable crimes, or does it simply allow us to consider her in a new light? Alexandra, as well as countless women of the past, have had their stories told by men who believe them to be the inferior sex, and investigating them through a feminist-colored lens allows the characters of historic women to be told with a fraction of sympathy that they very well may deserve. Alexandra was obviously flawed, and a great deal of her critics make substantial points, but through looking at her in a way that sheds light on the gender biases that existed at the time, we can conclude that Alexandra was used as a scapegoat for a number of people and issues at the time. Historians and contemporaries alike blame her for the destruction of the royal family, when the seeds of the problems she was blamed for effectuating had been sown by the Romanov ancestors that came before her husband. It was noted by Edmund Walsh, an American author and professor who was extremely critical of the Tsarina, in his 1928 Atlantic article that, quote, Russia was the last island fortress of absolutism in the rising tide of democracy, end quote, heading quickly toward change as their autocratic leaders attempted to hold them back. Despite the fact that the following pages of his work criticize Alexandra, Walsh admits that a portion of the problems existed before she married Nicholas. That being said, Alexandra was nowhere near perfect as a person or as a leader. She was at the very center of a political system that harmed the masses. The idea of an imperial society is inherently flawed and harmful to the common people. But should the imperials born into a life and rank they had no say in be punished for these crimes? Revolutionaries would say yes, and I tend to agree. What complicates the situation with Alexandra is that she seemed to hold more power than her title afforded her. In the Russian government, the Tsarina was revered, but she did not actually hold a great deal of political power. However, due to the strength of Nicholas and Alexandra's marriage and Nicholas's supposed timid nature, she at the very least had a significant influence on the throne. Alexandra may have, as many historians have claimed through chuckles, worn the pants in the relationship, giving her a greater influence than past Tsarinas, However, she was still little more than a figurehead. Nicholas often confided in her, but at the end of the day, he consulted with a number of advisors as well. One cannot definitively state which, if any, of the Tsar's crimes were a result of his wife's words or actions. In the very simplest of explanations, the Russian Revolution was, as revolutions tend to be, a cataclysmic mess. It ended a centuries-old dynasty and completely altered the lifestyle of the largest country in the world. The Russian people had every right to revolt, their arguments more than justified in terms of morality and a desire for inalienable human rights. The Tsar should have been working harder toward helping his people, as he was the supreme leader of the country. Is that not the duty of a people's leader? There is no doubt that Alexandra and Nicholas were flawed leaders. Alexandra was born into semi-royalty, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She was always destined for marriage to someone of rank, destined to sin by association against the commoners of whatever land her future husband might have controlled. And Nicholas, the man she fought to marry, was never cut out to be a Tsar. As a Tsarevich, he was too soft and too immature for such work. In his defense, he was never given much training, and had the divine right of kings drilled into his head. Nicholas's father, Tsar Alexander III, believed him to be too weak for the position of Tsar, considering the young man too childlike in his demeanor. When Nicholas's father died decades earlier than expected, it was no surprise that the young man assumed the throne with remarkable ineptitude. This, paired with centuries of mistakes and a world that was progressing slowly but surely, led to the fall of the last Russian royal family. Alexandra was blamed for the mistakes that Nicholas made when he was following just in the footsteps of his father. Alexander Iswolsky, a former minister to Nicholas's father, Tsar Alexander III, notes in his memoirs that Nicholas's upbringing was one in which, quote, self-effacement and passive obedience, end quote, precipitated his ineptness as a Tsar. It was no secret to the autocrats around him that Nicholas was facing a daunting task that he was in no way qualified to combat. Alexander himself noted that Nicholas was, quote, still a boy, and that his judgments are those of a perfect child, end quote, when Sergei Witte, the Prime Minister of Russia, suggested that Alexander give Nicholas a position as the chairman of the Committee for Construction to give the young man some experience for when his time as Tsar came. One could consider this as something far less concerning than it actually was. Perhaps Alexander was simply trying to protect his son, that such a job would have been too overwhelming for Nicholas at the time. And that line of thinking would be understandable if we did not know the year in which Alexander made this statement. It was 1892. Nicholas was 24 years old and 2 years away from being the Tsar of Russia. Interestingly enough, Alexandra was only 22 years old when she moved to a foreign country, in which many powerful people disliked her. She was regarded as cold and hateful for her inexperience, but Nicholas is considered far less sinister in the eyes of the Russian people and historians. Nicholas was regarded as having a childlike innocence or gentle nature, while Alexandra faced harsh criticism. The aforementioned Walsh states in his article that, quote, men are swayed by powerful human emotions, and that women create them, end quote. He then goes on to claim that, quote, neurotic females can be as elegantly indifferent to the realities of life and war as ever Montesquieu was to the existence of God, end quote. The language used regarding each of their flaws is blatantly biased. Before we can begin studying Alexandra's early days of Tsarina-ship, I think it's important to understand her childhood, as it played a key role in the formation of her disposition the Russian people and historians hated so much. Alexandra was born Princess Alex of Hessen by Rhine to Prince Louis of Hesse-Darmstadt and Princess Alice of the United Kingdom, the second daughter of Queen Victoria, during the summer of 1872. She was a healthy baby, her delicate little features bearing a striking resemblance to her mother's and other Hanoverian relatives. Princess Alice, in a letter to her mother, stated that, quote, Alex is a sweet, merry little person. Princess Alice ran a close-knit household. the group of royals being very much a family. Alex had a number of siblings, herself being the second youngest. The siblings included Princess Victoria, Elizabeth, called Ella, Irene, Princess Ernest, called Ernie, Friedrich, called Friddy. They all came before her, and then Princess Maria followed her. In addition to being the mother of a happy household, Princess Alice, Alex's mother, was a dedicated philanthropist. She worked tirelessly for the sick and disenfranchised of their little German duchy, taking on more and more work during her short time as the Grand Duchess after the deaths of her husband's father and brother made him the Grand Duke. This selflessness and desire to help those less fortunate was something passed on to her daughters. Alex would, after becoming Alexandra Feodorovna, go on to establish charities and work as a nurse in Russia. How is it, then, that a princess nicknamed Sunny transformed into a sullen woman regarded as one of the most tragic women in history? The dark cloud that loomed over her began as many dark times in history often did: illness. Princess Alice was a carrier of hemophilia, a blood condition that ravaged the descendants of Queen Victoria. The girls were carriers, and Friedrich was a hemophiliac. The condition impacted the clotting of one's blood, making most injuries fatal. Friedrich, when only 2 years old, fell from his mother's bedroom window onto some architectural shafts below. He survived the fall, but the hemophilia that plagued him would cause a brain hemorrhage that would then kill the young boy just hours after his fall. While Alex was only a few months old at the time, the death of her brother impacted her greatly. Her mother was transformed from the happy woman she had been to someone who retreated within herself, religion, and charity. Alex never truly knew little Friddy, but the dark shadow of his untimely death plagued Alex's mother for the rest of her life, which then extended to Alex herself. The death of Friddy would not be the greatest tragedy of her childhood, though. In the late fall of 1878, Alex was only 6 years old when diphtheria spread through the family. The disease affected the nose and throat, the infection making it difficult to breathe and swallow. While nearly eradicated today, the disease was often fatal before modern medicine. The Grand Duke, Irene, Ernie, and Marie fell ill first. Alex followed, her case being perceived as the most concerning of the other family members. Alice was an impeccable nurse, moving from room to room, nursing her dear children back to health. Despite Alice's hard work and prayers, Princess Marie died of the disease on the 16th of November at the age of 4. This devastated the family. The Grand Duke and Duchess had lost another child, while the children, especially Alex and Ernie, had lost a beloved playmate. As grief ran through the family and her little ones' bodies, Alice did her best to console them. She gave the distraught 9-year-old Ernie a kiss and soon fell ill herself. As the rest of the family seemed to be on the mend, Alice became weaker and weaker until she too died on December 14th. Alex was never the same after this. Her sunny disposition faded away and was replaced by a sad, nervous woman beyond her years. After Alice's death, Alex took on a number of responsibilities to help her father in the leading of their little duchy, something that would be passed down to her own daughters, Olga and Tatiana, who attended a number of events with their father when Alexandra had taken ill. Queen Victoria took an interest in her granddaughter Alex. She guided her through letters and governesses and visits to the United Kingdom. She was one of Victoria's favorite grandchildren, which meant she spent a great deal of money and time to make sure that her granddaughter was raised to be a sophisticated autocrat, worthy of a powerful royal husband. Alex denied a number of suitors that Queen Victoria placed before her in favor of the Tsarevich of Russia, her second cousin, whom she'd met during a visit to Russia for her sister Ella's wedding. Victoria and Nicholas's parents, Tsar Alexander III and Maria Feodorovna, were against the union, but the two were in love and determined. Despite this determination and attraction, the couple narrowly avoided the impossibility of their potential marriage. Alex was a devout Lutheran, so the idea of converting to Russian Orthodoxy was incredibly difficult for her. She eventually relented and worked toward converting so that she could marry her longtime love and future Tsar of Russia. While a sorrowful origin story does not make up for the crimes of the future, the circumstances of Alexandra's childhood, of the dark cloud that hung over her there, these are important aspects of who she was that need to be considered when one is judging her character. The coronation of Tsar Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra was a day of great celebration throughout Russia. People from all over the country came to get a glimpse of their new Tsar. They came for a reception, one in which tokens and foods were to be served. The crowd surpassed any expectations that the royals and event planners could have made when it came to attendance. The guards ended up being unable to control the crowds, who had become unruly after a rumor of lack of party favors passed from ear to ear and riots ensued. What followed was a human stampede, known as the Kudinka tragedy, in which 1,300 people died. The new Tsar and Tsarina were said to have been upset over the disaster, however, at the instruction of their advisors, continued to celebrate. Coronation Day tragedy aside, the hatred for Alexandra began before she really had a chance to set foot in her new home. What many would consider respectable ancestry, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria was not favorable with the Russian people. Russia and Britain had an unspoken rivalry, the large Russian landmass constantly in an unspoken battle against the politically powerful England. Alexandra was also German. Her father was the Grand Duke of a German duchy. Germany had also been known to bicker with Russia over the years. Alexandra struggled with the Russian language, and expected the simplistic type of court she was accustomed to in Hesse or in England, but was instead met with a lavish court full of Russian family and aristocracy. Nicholas's mother, as well as other members of the royal family, mocked her behind her back, as well as forced her ladies-in-waiting to tell them every detail of the new Empress's day. Alexandra, being a shy, anxious girl, already found it difficult to assimilate into a place where she felt so uncomfortable and unloved by everyone but her husband. Her bouts of illness added to the dislike of her. Alexandra had been suffering from different illnesses for years. She claimed to suffer from an enlarged heart, sciatic pain, and more. While the medical records of the time are less than ideal, many doctors noted that she did suffer from something. They were not always necessarily certain what it was that plagued the Tsarina, but many conceded that she was ill in some way, whether it be of body or mind. She was known to get headaches, perhaps migraines, and was incredibly shy and anxious about the safety of her family. Because of this, she often hid away in her rooms, lying on a chaise lounge as her daughters sat around her with their needlework. The people expected her to be out and about instead of hiding away in her apartments. She's judged so harshly for being closed off, but wouldn't most people retreat within themselves if they were ridiculed day in and out within the borders of a foreign country? We can look back now and see that her incessant fears regarding the safety of her family were not baseless. There was enough evidence at the time to prove that the family was in danger of revolutionaries. But now we have an even clearer image of dangers that face them from all sides. Revolutionaries, distant family, foreign wars, etc. Alexandra is often criticized for the harsh way in which she spoke with Nicholas, how she pushed him to act a certain way. Just as many other royal wives, Alexandra wanted her husband to be a tough ruler. She was tired of watching advisors and the Duma walk all over the man she believed to be sent by God to govern. As the monarchy began to crumble, Alexandra famously told him to, quote, be firm, end quote, in the face of revolutionaries, reminding Nicholas that, quote, Russia loves to feel the whip. It's their nature. How I wish I could pour my will into your veins. Be Peter the Great. Ivan the Terrible. Crush them all under you. End quote. Many wonder why she would encourage such behavior of a man who had already fallen out of favor amongst his people. They had to have known that the tide was turning, and that now more than ever they needed the love of the Russian people. Many argue that Alexandra should have known that she should not have used that power that she had over Nicholas. She shouldn't have tried to convince the usually meek man into such behavior. What everyone fails to acknowledge is that Nicholas had been told to toughen up his entire life. His father thought him too weak a boy, and his mother believed he was too lenient with Azar. Nicholas had been told since birth of his feeble nature. Alexandra's insistence that he assert his authority did not cause that behavior to erupt from within him. Whatever firmness he used when speaking with or instilled in his men after this marital exchange had been planted years earlier. The way in which those in Nicholas's command brutalized Russian citizens were not born of Alexandra's hopes for a stronger husband. That being said, the urgency in which Alexandra pleaded with Nicholas to leave a better, healthier Russia for their son, for the beloved boy that they'd yearned for all these years, would have caused these impulses that had been sown within the Tsar to erupt. War can be a heavily complicated subject for any nation. The consequences of war can vary, the future of a nation a gamble before the first shot is even fired. At times, such as the United States during the Second World War, a wartime economy can boost the overall financial health of a nation. War can bring about a sense of nationalism, a team effort to band an entire country together despite their differences. Russia's two final wars before the 1917 revolution were unsuccessful. At the start of both wars, many believed that it would help unite the broken Russian people, that they would come together as Russians did to defend their enemy, but as more battles were lost and mothers continued to lose their sons, the Russian people quickly opposed the wars and that they deemed unnecessary. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 was a result of the Russian government trying to expand into Asia. They believed it would be an easy win, but the Japanese claimed a unanimous victory. Following this loss, a large group of protesters made their way to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, where they falsely believed that Tsar Nicholas II would be there to hear their complaints. They wanted better working conditions, higher wages, and the institution of a Russian parliament. Unbeknownst to them, Nicholas and his family were not at the Winter Palace, but away. Many believed that Nicholas was not even aware of the planned march. When they were denied entry and access to the Tsar, the crowd was rightfully upset. The guards opened fire on the crowd, murdering and wounding hundreds. This event was largely regarded as the beginning of the Russian Revolution, and would end the monarchy a decade and a half later. Another aspect of Alexandra that many historians criticize is the alleged favoritism that she displays in the way in which she spoke of and treated her children. When the royal couple's oldest child, Olga, was born, the two were in high spirits. A healthy baby girl usually meant that healthy sons could follow. Olga's birth confirmed that the couple could indeed conceive a child. Unlike some of Western Europe, where denying royal women the right to rule in their own right had fallen out of favor, it was against the Russian legal code, c'est la loi, to allow women to inherit the throne from their fathers. This rule dates back to the death of Catherine the Great. Her son had so thoroughly hated her that he wanted to prevent any other woman from ruling Russia again. Despite the fact that Olga's birth had been downright torturous for the Empress, she understood that having royal children was her single greatest task as the wife of the Tsar, so she soon fell pregnant again. She had 3 more daughters in relatively quick succession, Tatiana, Maria, and then Anastasia. With each birth, there was less enthusiasm from both the royal family and the country itself. One can only imagine the pain of going through tumultuous after tumultuous pregnancy, only to find out that the baby you have given birth to will never be accepted as the leader of Russia, therefore making it necessary for you to get pregnant again. Pregnancy and childbirth was never easy for Alexandra. Aside from wanting a son for dynastic purposes, it would not be unfounded for her to have been looking forward to putting childbearing behind her. Fortunately for Alexandra, a son would follow Anastasia. Tsarevich Alexei was born and became the heir to the Russian throne. The Romanovs were very much a family. While Alexei was awarded the titles and privileges of being the first in line to the throne, that did not mean he was the sole receiver of love of the Romanov children. Heirs to the royal throne have been treated differently by their parents for centuries all over the world. Why is it only deemed favoritism in this case? Why are the complicated politics and procedures of a royal family tossed aside when determining the quality of Alexandra's mothering? Why have historians forgotten about the way other European heirs, such as the Princes of Wales, are regarded in comparison to their siblings when discussing the Tsarina? For centuries, royal families have been sending their young daughters to foreign lands as bargaining chips, using them as commodities to secure whatever deal they're trying to make. These daughters were used in every sense of the word. Alexandra, however, never forced marriage upon her daughters. Olga, the eldest daughter, was 22 at the time of the family's execution, practically an old spinster by the day's standards. But she was never forced into something she did not want. There had been brief talk of her considering marriage to the Prince of Romania, but after the families had an official meeting in which the royal children did not really get along too well, the issue was dropped. Alexandra loved her daughters in a way that she couldn't love Alexei. She was able to instill in them her personal beliefs and guide them through life. Alexei would grow up to become Tsar and belong to Russia, but her daughters had more options than that. While they were surely destined for a marriage to a high-ranking man sometime in the future, they could still go on to be nurses, women of the cloth, artists, philanthropists, mothers. Alexandra was training her daughters to be good people, while Alexei was being trained to become Tsar. Of course, they were treated differently. A documentary following and discussing the lives of the four Romanov daughters, titled Russia's Lost Princesses, describes examples of Alexandra's unconventional parenting. Helen Rappaport, an expert in revolutionary Russia, states that in the documentary that the girls, quote, tidied their rooms, they made their beds, end quote. The four grand duchesses were, quote, early to bed, early to rise, they ate plain nursery food, took cold baths in the morning, end quote. They were never spoiled. This upbringing is often criticized by historians, but one can struggle to find the problem with teaching one's children to tidy or remain humble and modest in the face of grandeur. Had these girls been spoiled from the moment they were born, Alexandra would have been criticized for that too. When analyzing Alexandra's relationship with her children, it is important to understand the complexity of Alexei's health and the impact that it had on the family. It was discovered shortly after his birth that the boy had hemophilia. Recent scientific studies have proven that the Tsarevich suffered from the more dangerous hemophilia B, a genetic mutation in which the blood does not clot properly. Alexandra had also inherited the mutation from her mother, who inherited it from her own mother, Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom. Women are usually only carriers of the disease, rarely showing too many symptoms, while men suffer greatly. This is because the genetic mutation impacts the X chromosome. Women have 2 X chromosomes and men have 1, inheriting the chromosome from their mother. If one's mother is a carrier of the mutation, a son would only receive her afflicted X chromosome, whereas a daughter would receive another X chromosome to balance the hemophilia chromosome. This mutation meant that any little bump or fall could cause bleeding in the joints and possibly death. Because of this, the tight circle of trusted friends became smaller, the family more reclusive. Alexei's condition was kept from the people, a decision made to hopefully prevent fears of instability within the Russian line of succession. This decision is an interesting one. It seems as though the imperial family had no clue what it was that actually worried their people. Russia had fallen from a time in where the populace worshipped the Tsar as infallible, a caring father figure that thought in their best interests, to ideas reminiscent of the 18th century France. By this time, the common Russian people were far more worried about the lack of food and horrendous working conditions than whether or not the archaic idea of governing had secured a healthy male heir. As animosity toward the imperial family intensified, perhaps knowing about Alexei's condition, therefore humanizing the royal family, could have altered the eventual outcome. When looking at the fall of this family, it's impossible now, through a modern lens, to deny that they were a loving family. We can see the humility in them that the Russian people couldn't. If the family had allowed their people in just a little more, let their vulnerability shine through at times, the populace may have been more patient with their shortcomings. Historians often use Alexei's illness to demonstrate Alexandra's protective nature, deemed favoritism toward the boy. She did dote on him, and worried daily for his safety. She sat at his bedside and prayed to God that he would be healed, but that in no way proves some unfounded idea that she did not love her daughters. When the girls fell ill, Alexandra cared for them as well. She did more for her daughters than most queens would have done. She was active in their lives, even the messy parts that most royal parents would have left for the governesses to handle. Lost Princesses is heavily critical of the Tsarina, saying that, quote, "In the Tsarina's mind, one little girl seemed to be as good as the other. She treated her daughters more as one homogeneous mass than as four distinct characters," end quote, a fact that can be debated. Numerous letters between the mother and daughters illustrate the different relationships that she had with each of them. It is clear through the writing left behind and by personal accounts of those closest to the family that Alexandra loved her daughters individually. When reading the diary entries of each daughter, primarily the older two, Olga and Tatiana, it is clear that she spent a great deal of time with them. The love that existed between Alexandra and her daughters is there if one is looking for it. We can see that within the oftentimes rocky relationship between Alexandra and the oldest daughter, Olga. They were so alike. Olga was so comfortable with her mother that conflicts could spark. Alexandra instilled argumentative values and a sense of deep morality within her daughters that allowed for such discussion. But despite this, Olga was very devoted to her mother and, quote, fiercely defensive, unquote, of her when the public or extended family spoke ill of her. The Grand Duchesses held a love for their mother that would not have existed in such a genuine way if there had not been a relationship that had clearly been built. While this argument itself may seem irrelevant in the grand scheme of things, it stems from an obvious gender bias and therefore should be discussed when analyzing Alexandra. Mothers are always held to a much higher standard, and the main duty of a consort was her ability to give the king or the Tsar heirs. Why is Alexandra the only one criticized for favoring Alexei, but Nicholas is not? Why is it okay for Nicholas to allow his son to walk ahead of and take advantage of his sister's kindness when Alexandra treats Alexei differently? She is a bad mother. Religion played a large but damaging role in the life of Alexandra. It was not simply a disagreement of theology, but a complicated mix of church politics, Russian canon, and personal belief. Religion was an issue from the very start, before the start actually. Alexandra was a Lutheran, a Protestant, as were most living in the German duchy that was her home. In order to marry Nicholas, it was imperative that she make the decision to convert to Russian Orthodoxy. Alexandra, hesitant to give up the religion of her late mother and siblings, almost refused. It took months of coaxing, but eventually she converted and was able to marry in Russia. Alexandra and the rest of the Russian royal family continued to be devout Orthodox Christians, something that became increasingly evident as the years went on. When the Tsarevich's illness became evident to the family, they turned to religion to cope with the pain of his diagnosis. Nicholas, Alexandra, and the couple's 4 daughters lived in constant fear of Alexei dying. The boy had been on his deathbed numerous times. In 1912, he nearly died after a bruise ruptured, and he developed a high fever. He was given his last sacrament, and, quote, an obituary to announce the passing of the heir to the throne had already been prepared, end quote. It wasn't until the disgraced Siberian peasant, Grigory Rasputin, a self-proclaimed holy man, sent a telegram claiming that the boy would survive that his health began to improve. It was after this moment that Rasputin, as well as the religious belief that the royal family had for him, was solidified and their fates sealed. The royal couple is often criticized for their relationship with Rasputin. They allowed this man into court when he, by social and court standards, has no business being there. The Siberian monk was known to drink an excess amount of alcohol and was seen frequenting sex workers. He was not someone that the royal family should have allowed within the walls of their palaces. They took the relationship much further, praying with the man and allowing him into the children's nurseries. Many found this detail troublesome, especially considering that the oldest girls, Olga and Tatiana, had grown into young women. Why was this man, known for his sexual escapades, allowed to visit the girls' bedrooms when they were in their nightclothes? This, paired with the fact that Alexandra herself was close to him, led to quite a scandal throughout the extended Russian royal family, court, and the rest of the country. Rumors were spread, and explicit cartoons were created of the Empress and Grand Duchesses with Rasputin. While the concerns of outsiders to this relationship are understandable, one can also understand why the Tsar and Tsarina were so dedicated to the man. Their beloved son was suffering, and his life in constant jeopardy because of a disease that no one had a cure for. Rasputin did seem to help the boy, and because of that, it's difficult to find fault with the couple for grasping at the only straw they had, even if it was in the form of a reprehensible Siberian peasant. What did the utmost damage to the family's status was the fact that, upon Nicholas's departure to the Eastern Front during the First World War, Alexandra was left with Rasputin, still very nearby. What little support remained from the members of court or the distant Romanov family quickly faded as Rasputin's presence and influence became more pronounced under the Tsarina's regency. It was believed by many that it was Alexandra and Rasputin truly ruling the country, not Nicholas or the Duma. There's no evidence that Rasputin had any real influence aside from an emotional one regarding the Tsarevich's health. Nevertheless, a plot was hatched by the Romanov family members, and Rasputin was eventually murdered. Even after he was gone, the damage had been done. Following Rasputin's death, Nicholas was forced to abdicate the throne for both himself and Alexei. So the family was dealing with not only the death of Rasputin, but with the advancement of revolutionaries, which led to the abdication and their eventual arrest. Them were under house arrest in the palace until Nicholas arrived home. The family was then under house arrest in Tobolsk before being moved to the Apatiev house in Ekaterinburg, where the family was murdered just a few months later. The series of events that occurred during the last few years of Imperial Russia had been seen before. In what seems to be the trend of Imperial Russia, they were behind the rest of Europe when it came to ideas of government. While Great Britain and France had moved away from absolute monarchies, Russia still clung tightly to the Tsar's divine right to rule the vast country with absolute power. A century earlier, the royal family of France met an equally bloody end. After years of suffering and starving, the impoverished French citizens dethroned King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette in a revolution so brutal that the royal family found themselves beheaded before cheering crowds. Marie Antoinette had become synonymous with the idea of revolution and courtly tragedies. She was torn from her throne, verbally abused, murdered, and then venerated by the very people who set out to do damage in the first place. Her life before becoming queen and her reputation within the French court is similar to Alexandra Feodorovna's. She was born in Austria to Empress Maria Theresa and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor. She was the 12th out of their 13 children, therefore her family did not really expect much from her. It was likely assumed that she would marry a nobleman or a low-ranking foreign prince, and that would be that. When Marie was chosen to wed the Dauphin instead of her older sister, who had been the original bride-to-be, everything changed. She had to learn how to behave in a way she never had. It became crucial for her to understand the French court and the politics that existed within it. When she made the trip, she was nowhere near as prepared as she should have been. She was tossed into France, forced to leave almost all she'd ever known behind for a land she'd yet to understand. Marie, like Alexandra, birthed a disappointing daughter before her son came along, and she never truly fit in within the court. She was nervous and afraid to eat in front of others, and she was referred to as the Austrian woman, just as Alexandra was referred to as the German woman. The queen was so far removed from the realities of her subject that she seemed cold and indifferent to their plights. Similarly, Alexandra faced the same criticisms, despite attempting to offer forms of charity. Small sums of money given by the richest women in the country does not make up for mistakes, nor does it take away from the inaction of the country's leaders. However, it should be noted that the idea of frivolous spending is almost always attributed to Alexandra and Marie, despite their attempts at charity, instead of their husbands, who often left such philanthropy to their wives and children. The Tsarina had to use her own personal money to pay for the numerous charities she wanted to open for wounded soldiers and the education of young girls, cutting back on her own. Despite the good they may have attempted to do, Alexandra Feodorovna and Marie Antoinette certainly hold some blame for their demise. They both upheld autocracy in societies that were very quickly moving away from such systems. That being said, the reason for which they both fell under such scrutiny has a great deal to do with their gender, as monarchies and similar systems justify gender bias in their practices. Mary Wilstoncraft, a prominent feminist writer of feminist issues during the time of the French Revolution, discusses the fact that while revolution is good for the everyday people and that worshipping royals is inherently problematic, she argued that the autocratic practices themselves are harmful to women. She is not sympathizing with the fallen queen. However, she does conclude that the character and ruling flaws that existed within the queen were a result of autocratic influence and not an inherent flaw in the woman herself. The stance Wollstonecraft takes is an interesting one. Oftentimes, it can be difficult to separate the monarch and the person from the figurehead, the beliefs from the movement. Laid out in this piece is the idea of monarchy itself perpetuating the mindset that would eventually allow for the mistrust of women who had seemingly small roles in the grand scheme of revolutions. Alexandra was imperfect. She could be moody and sometimes short with those around her. She believed deeply in the idea of divine right. She felt that she deserved the love of the Russian people simply by marrying Nicholas. Her frequent bouts of illness were used to keep her daughters in line, telling them that any reports of misbehavior would worship her condition. These idiosyncrasies were certainly troubling, qualities that many would rightly dislike. However, they did not make her an utterly evil woman. Where an unsavory quality existed, one rooted in generosity or theology existed as well. She was a human being, imperfect and complicated. It would be understandable for those around her to not necessarily enjoy the company of the Tsarina. What is not understandable or justified in any way, in my opinion, is the slander she continues to receive. Regardless of one's opinion regarding the Tsarina's illnesses or her behavior, she did not single-handedly bring forth the end of the Romanov dynasty. Defenses of her will not change the history books, nor will it justify the injustices of a corrupt system of government. Having a better understanding of this complicated woman will never reverse her brutal execution. Examining the life of Alexandra Feodorovna sheds light on the treatment of the woman that came before us. No one is claiming that Alexandra was innocent, nor was her death entirely unfounded. However, we can conclude that she received a great deal of criticism that she didn't deserve. She was no worse than her husband or any absolute ruler, yet she is spoken of with incredible disdain. Women have and will always be held to a higher standard despite having less opportunity than the opposite sex.